Native and Indigenous women. I want to welcome you to our panel about Native and Indigenous women in the workplace. I want to just briefly give you a little bit of information about OCCJ. So we're a social justice focused nonprofit, and our mission is to inspire and equip Oklahomans to overcome bias, bigotry, and oppression. And our vision is that in our generation, we want Oklahoma to be a more inclusive, just, and hospitable state for all. So as you know, this work is challenging in our current climate, but we try and take steps every day to create meaningful and lasting impact on Oklahoma. And one of those steps are these panel discussions with which we aim to engage in dialogue about real topics affecting Oklahomans. So I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. We've got Vanessa Adams-Harris, Erin Parker, and Vivian Morris. I will read their bios in just a minute. But I want to thank the panelists for joining us, and thank you for everyone else who's joining us today for this discussion. So let me read about our panelists. So Erin Parker is the lead resource advisor for Tulsa Public Schools Indian Education Program. She's enrolled absentee Shawnee, but is also Kiowa, Cherokee, and Kickapoo. She works for Tulsa Public Schools, as I said, Indian Education Program as the lead resource advisor. She taught 8th grade language arts at Edison Middle School for 6 years, and this is her 7th year with Indian Ed. She's married and has an 8-year-old son, and she loves her job because she gets to provide academic and cultural support to over 3,000 Native American students at TPS, which includes her son. Next, we got Vivian Morris at the Oklahoma Policy Tribal State Policy Analyst, right? So Vivian joined OK Policy as the Tribal State Policy Analyst in August 2021. She is Alabama, federally recognized as Alabama, oh, forgive my pronunciation, Casort tribal town, Muskogee, Seminole, and Dene, Navajo. Raised in rural Oklahoma, she describes herself as a nomadic esticate, which is Muskogee Seminole for Native or Indigenous. She completed her Master of Public Administration degree with a public policy concentration from the University of Oklahoma in May 2022, and holds dual bachelor's degrees in Women and Gender Studies and Environmental Studies, with a minor in Native American Studies from the University of Oklahoma. Vivian was a member of the 2022 AICCO Leadership Native Oklahoma class, recipient of the 2022 OU WGS Alice Mary Robertson Award, and Metriarch's 2023 Breakthrough Maven Award. In her free time, you will likely hear her elongating her A's and E's with good company around a fire, or both. And next we have Vanessa Adams-Harris. Vanessa is Muskogee Creek American Indian with African American and European ancestry. She's an artist/actor, giving particular interest to the historical accuracy of African American and Indigenous aesthetic. A producer, director, documentary filmmaker, AACT adjudicator, workshop facilitator/presenter, playwright, docent, human rights community activist, peace builder, and spirit walker. Wow, that's amazing. So she has performed and or presented both nationally and internationally. She's outreach and alliances for the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation, where she trains community members to become docents, discussing the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and the history of African American and Native peoples in Oklahoma, as well as a 2018 Oklahoma. Sorry, y'all, I found out I was doing these bios about 10 minutes ago, so I'm really sorry if I get these pronunciations incorrectly. So Chautauqua scholar, and is training with an international coalition of women as drivers towards peace building, just governance, human security X initiatives of Change Ca, Switzerland. Currently, she is pursuing an MFA in interdisciplinary studies from Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, and her emphasis is on theater arts/place and identity. Thank you all again for joining us, and I'm going to pass it to Victoria.
Thank you so much for reading that, Shadi. I'm so sorry for giving you such late notice, but thank you all for bearing with us. It's a growing and learning environment, so thank you for bearing with us through this. As Shadi said, my name is Victoria Dankton Devon-Attigan. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I work as the program coordinator here at OCCJ, mainly with the Inclusive Leadership Institute, which I know some of you all from, and then I also do host the panels. So thank you all for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping before we hop into this amazing discussion. Please feel free to utilize the chat function for any questions you might have or any conversations that you would like to engage in throughout the panel. As participants, if we can all keep ourselves on mute, just so that we allow space for our speakers to really share from their hearts on this very important topic, and they are also the experts. So thank you all for engaging and leaning in that way. And I just want to take a brief moment to shout out to our OCCJ staff on this call with us. As you all know, Shadi Nadre, she is our office administrator, amazing. She really keeps a lot of things going. And then we have Kara Golden, who's also our programs director, my supervisor, and really helps make sure that our programs are successful in running. So thank you all for joining in that time. So with that, I'll jump straight into the discussion, starting with our first question for our panelists. Can you unpack for us why it's important to have this important conversation, right? What are the challenges that affect Native and Indigenous women, and why is that a conversation we should have? And no order, feel free to jump in as you feel.
I don't mind jumping in here to get the ball rolling. So first off, Mado, thank you for including us in this important discussion that is often left out. And I think that's the best way to answer this first question, is that we are often, unfortunately, left out of the conversation. And I think it's important to consider our lived experience, not only as Indigenous women, but as well in the context of the wage gap and economic security and hardship. And I always embrace nothing about us without us. And so for me, I think it always makes the best sense to be inclusive of the population which you're focusing in here. That's us. And so happy to pass it from there. I won't go deeper than that.
So I will jump in now. Thank you all for having me and for having this discussion. This is very exciting, actually, because there are not a lot of organizations that want to have a discussion around Indigenous, in particular, women. And it's a big issue, really, because you're not going to see us otherwise. And the relevance of wanting to hear the voices, see the faces, see who is attached to Indigenous and how that's promoted, especially in the workplace or other places, is, and I'm a land back girl, Vivian. So just so you know. But yeah, thanks.
I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here. I feel like this is an important conversation as well. For me in my field, being in education, I've always been the only Native teacher that a lot of my students have ever had. I get a lot of questions from them, but also a lot of encouragement, and I just love dealing with all of my students, whether they're Native or not, because before I was in Indian Ed, I just taught English, 8th grade language arts. And I just have like a vivid memory because I was pregnant with my son the last year that I was in the classroom, and my students were just so excited for me because they were like, you're Native and your husband's Native and your baby's going to be Native. And that's just so cool. So I was like, I've done something right, that they understand that that's important for me. But I just feel like being included, because a lot of things I do is behind the scenes. I always tell people what I do is kind of like preventative care. My philosophy is if my students have a strong cultural identity and self-identity, that will lead to their academic success. And I know that's not something that can be put on a test and measured, but I know that it matters. So
thank you all for sharing that. So next question, what is the biggest forms of marginalization that you all think Native women face in the workplace? I know this is a tough one. As I was writing this question, I was like, this is gonna be a thought-provoking one.
I feel like we get dismissed a lot. In person, I am very quiet and reserved, but I will speak up when I need to. And I think that's taken as a weakness, and people get surprised by me when I do speak up. And so it's just feeling like you're a part of the conversation. That's always hard. It's kind of like they don't even think about us. There's been situations like I've helped write curriculum, and there'll be certain things that were written that I have to say, hey, you know, that could be taken wrong by a Native student. Can we include this? And so it's just always, you end up being the token in the room. You end up being the person that has to explain everything. And I have to also explain to people that I know about my tribes and I know about the people I've grown up with, but there's so many tribes that I will never know everything about everything. So you kind of have to end up trying to explain so much to so many people.
I can go next. I would say some of the more tangible consequences of sexism and white supremacy and just the inherent devaluation of women. And then you combine that with being a person of color. And I feel like that can be situated from also being Indigenous in the US, because oftentimes, again, we're not represented, or we've been historically marginalized, and that's been ongoing. When white supremacy continues on, the oppression of our population continues on too. But I don't want to inherently deficit frame us. When it comes to the workplace, I would say some of the larger issues are what Erin just touched on being what I have called professionally tokenized. So it's often the situation where people automatically assume you're speaking for all of Indian country, for all Indians everywhere. And at the core of our sharing or our work is how we perceive the world around us, right? With social constructs and our own lived experience. So my perspective will always be rooted in my traditional identity and my lived experience as an identifiable Native woman. And I know and I say identifiable because your lived experience is inherently differentiated with social constructs such as colorism, or whether you have access to your culture, and things in that nature. They really play a role. So I don't want to play trauma wars either, but there are so many multi-layers of marginalization that happen in and outside of the workplace that are rooted in social constructs.
And so I'm just gonna piggyback on both of them and add that in the work that I do, I inform people right up front that the lens that I use in describing life and things is going to come from two perspectives, a Native as well as an African American. And because I know myself and my family, then I like to make sure that I share that with people. So when they hear some things, they'll realize that I'm talking from a place that I'm very familiar with and I know. And on the other side of that, sometimes when you're talking to people and you're talking like you take it for granted that sometimes people just realize that, you know, when you say you're Native, that means that your parent is Native, that is not some off place in the sphere of bloodlines. And in this case, you know, my father is Native. And so I had a woman say, "You knew him?" And I'm like, "My daddy? Yep." Yep, I did. That's who raised me. So when you're in the work environment too, it's I find sometimes that I'm always reminding that that's my perspective, that's my lens that I'm using. That's what I'm speaking from, because I don't see the world in this other place. I just had a conversation with some professors, and the professor kept using the word institution, and I had to finally say, I can't hear that word institution anymore. It is almost like a cuss word. And so find another way to get to me, because institution, I have an issue with that. Yeah.
Thank you all. So speaking of like history and how history has affected our current space, right, especially in Oklahoma, how would you say historical compensation, jobs, and job skills following the land seizures tended to have excluded Indigenous women? Would you all want me to repeat that again? Okay, sorry, I'll go with slower. So thinking from like a historical lens on how history has affected us today. So historical land seizures of Native American land all across the US, especially in Oklahoma as well. How would you say the compensation and job skills following those land seizures has affected Indigenous women today, seeing that Indigenous women were excluded from, job skills and the compensations during that time?
I think when it comes to the gender binary, traditionally speaking, all of my nations are matrilineal. And so when you consider how we've always, I wouldn't say there's a duality or advantage of being one gender versus the other, but there's always been again, speaking from my perspective and my family's historic storytelling, we are definitely more so rooted in just understanding that things need to be taken care of versus assigning things based on gender, sorry. And so I would say removing that power balance that has traditionally been part of my historical knowledge in communities, that's been a huge factor. But even more so talking about compensation and economic security, the overall lack of land ownership and injustice in Indian country by the federal government and stewards of the government, they continue to impact us daily, because I just consider what generational wealth has done for some families. And so the taking of Native land has consequently delayed or prevented many Native families from generational wealth and the pathways that generational wealth enables. And I intentionally say delayed because many of us are working towards bridging that gap, but we must work harder. As described by the National Partnership for Women and Families, even today, us Native women in the US are typically only paid 55 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men. And across tribes too, as we continue to build up those economies, wage gaps continue to persist and undermine job security for Native women as well. And so when I think about sustaining our households, I think about my own upbringing in a single mom household and how that wage gap impacted my upbringing and livelihood. And so there are so many ways and pieces that the historical injustice still persist in various ways in our lives.
Well, and just to piggyback on what Vivian expressed so well, I find through my lens, I find that when I'm thinking about this, especially with land seizures and then the denial of access to goods and services for the very people and toward the very people that this was done to, it's still very hurtful and painful. Yeah, it's still very painful, because you can see the effects if you just drive in the rural community, especially, and forget about in an urban space, but in the rural community where some of us still have land in our families and such, and because women know what to do for their family, then we might think it's everything is okay or there's nothing going on. But because that's what you've been doing all along. And it's painful to know that where at one time your family had 80 acres, right? I mean, you might have grown up on part of that and played on the rest of it and known where all the other parts of your family was. And over the years, to see how corporations and other people have chopped off. And so now you're only left with 10 acres. It's just, yeah, how are you supposed to then take care of what your family has been taking care of for years? The women in your family have been taken care of for years, right? So I hope that makes sense.
Just trying to figure out how to come at this. Like I mean, I'm a teacher. I'm on a teacher contract. That's how I'm paid. And that, you know, historically, that's a whole nother issue of the way that we're compensated. And so being an educator, and on top of that, a woman, and on top of that, Indigenous, it's, you know, that's a lot. And I don't know if it's just like a coping mechanism, historical trauma, what, but like I've just grown up. My mom was a social worker and she worked for tribes in child abuse prevention programs. And she was never, you know, going to make a lot of money in that. And so I think from watching her, it was more about do something you're passionate about, do something that has a purpose, do something that's ultimately going to help community. And so it's never really been about money. I mean, I'm, you know, I have an education. My mom had an education. We had education to get the jobs that we have. But, you know, the same amount of school that I had to do in certifications I have, if I was a lawyer, I'd be making probably double what I'm making as an educator. But it's all about community for me. And I ultimately knew that I just wanted to help children and help them to not have to deal with the things that I did growing up and having hard time in school. And so I wanted to be that safe adult for them. And so, but then talking about land, like right now, one of the things we're doing at TPS is we are literally, like right before I got on here, I was delivering tribal flags to my schools of the land that they're on. And so at Tulsa Public Schools, we're partially on Osage, Muskogee Creek, and Cherokee land. And we had started out, only 3 of our high schools had received an outdoor flag because we've had to learn so much about flags. If you're going to fly a tribal flag, you have to have 2 flag poles because the Oklahoma and the United States flag can fly on one. So you have to have that second flag pole in order to fly a tribal flag. Not all of our schools have that. So we found 3 of our high schools that were within those 3 tribal lands, and they got their flags first. And then our Education Service Center also got a flag. And then since we weren't able to do outdoor flags, we ordered indoor flags. And so right now that's what we're doing is we're delivering those indoor flags to all of our schools. So when every student, whether they're Native or not, they're going to know what land that they're on at the school that they attend. So I think it's a small thing, but I also think it's important. And for the Native kids that understand, they see that flag and they know that they're being recognized. And then for the non-Native kids, I'm sure they can ask questions. We're also posting the land acknowledgement that TPS uses, and that's going to be next to the flag that they have. And then we actually do a lesson for the schools that ask us to come in, and we teach them about the 39 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma. And there's actually, in TPS, we have over 50 tribes represented because, you know, not all kids are from here. But I don't know. It's kind of like 2 separate things because I know you're talking about land and compensation, but just kind of, those are the kind of ways that I'm connecting with that question.
That makes sense. And that's a perfect lead into the next question. So thank you so much for you know, bringing us to that. And so that question is, do you see representation, not just culturally, but of people in Native and Indigenous culture and people in our different workspaces? So thinking in education and policy and, you know, the nonprofit museums perspective, what do we see representation of Native culture and people?
don't see enough. We don't see enough. How can you have museums and you have works there and not have a curator that represents that lens and that perspective? How can you have a university and not have Indian law professors and such? How can you not? I mean, it's tiring, because what I always think about is as a child, what does the child see when they come into those spaces? Are they identifying with the same kind of perspective that's been pushed off on us for years? And they don't have the same voice as a child. They don't have that same voice. So are they even going to say anything? And just thinking about myself as a child, representation that I saw and my expectation, I was taught not to have that expectation when I go into those institutional places. And I knew not to have that expectation there. But children that don't have that teaching, what are we saying if they don't see someone that looks like them or has that particular lens and knows what they're experiencing, what they're talking about? We just don't have enough. We don't have enough in the grocery store, have enough at car dealerships. I mean, there's not enough. And so people act like, oh, they're still Indians. They're still here. It's impossible to truly, without being too negative, I don't want to be too negative, but I do want to just say that it's not enough, right? There are people that can do these jobs that know this work, and it's not enough. And I'm always asking the question, where are the women and where's the representation? I want to know when I walk into a place.
I agree, there's not enough. So in my job with Indian Ed, we're resource advisors, that's our title, but all of the resource advisors, there's supposed to be 6 of us because we have 73 schools and we try to split it between the 6 of us. And in our position, you have to be a certified teacher and you have to know Native culture. And it's been really hard to fill those positions because that's really hard to find. We've tried to work with colleges to see who's coming through there. Are any of them Native? Could we somehow get a list? And then also just even at Tulsa Public Schools, we try to get a list of who the Native teachers are. And then that's hard because then they say, is it people that just self-identify? Is it people that actually have a card? How are we going to do that? And so just finding 6 Native teachers that also actually know their culture, I didn't think it was that difficult. I mean, and I didn't realize that me having those qualifications was something unique. I just, you just think you're a person, you're just doing something, and then you realize they're looking for that specifically. And as far as just Native teachers in general, yeah, it's hard to find. And these students, I've literally had students that say, I didn't know Natives were still alive, and they're in Oklahoma, and it's and they ask you so many questions because they just don't know. So yeah, there's not enough.
I also agree with Erin and Vanessa that there isn't enough representation. But when you ask, do I see positive representation of Indigenous women in the workplace? I want to say yes every day when I look in the mirror. It's the best answer, right? Because we're still here, we're still doing the thing. And I didn't want to answer this in a complete negative way, but I think in being transparent, we don't always see positive representation. And this is more so true speaking from my perspective of working in political spaces. I can't help but to consistently recall the social constructs which our society, our communities are made up. Who's Indian, who's not, who's Indian enough, who's culturally still significant, who still has the privilege. I feel like that's the best way of saying it. Who still has the privilege of still holding on and caretaking of their culture, of their fires, of their medicines. But in my job specifically, I often hear the phrase, you got to play the game. You got to play the game to win, like the policy reform that we're trying, something much more equitable that may not align with political values, but aligns with our community-centered values. But I don't think playing the game should be something that comes to your values and community, but it's so often affiliated with how we find or get to justice for communities that have been disenfranchised or communities that have been harmed. And so I do think about the work and the representation that I bring to the table when I'm participating, when I'm in community with Erin and Vanessa and other natives out in Oklahoma that are doing the good work. I just don't think there's been enough media on how we've contributed and how we are truly, as Vanessa said earlier, we are in a land back movement, especially here in Oklahoma at the heart of it all. McGirt v. Oklahoma, though it feels very personal to Oklahoma, had impacts all across the United States. And so land back is very real, and that's something that's very relative to the positive representation in the workspace, because we've had longtime federal Indian law attorneys, or just your everyday Oklahoma Indigenous, or not just Oklahoma, but Indigenous women standing up and standing tall to historical injustices. I can't help but think about like Eloise Cobell, you know, and the fight she went for and found justice. Even, and I hate it that, please Google, if y'all have not heard of Eloise Cobell, please Google her, look into her, because she fought year after year against the federal government and getting economic security, not only for her own nation, but for a lot of neighboring nations, which the federal government was not adequately handling their finances. And she found a huge win for economic security and growth for Indian country in that sense. And so I think there's some truth to not having enough, but there's also some truth and we're not highlighted enough. We're still very invisible. We're still being erased, but I'm holding on to the hope that organizations such as Illuminative, who currently has a survey out, you know, collecting data to better systemic institutionalized knowledge, gatekeeping, things of that nature, who's also working with mass media. We have representation such as Reservation Dogs, the series from Sterling Harjo, who comes right out of Holdenville, Oklahoma, and is based on a lot of my native language, Seminole Creek. And so when I think about being seen now as an adult woman, I'm just like, yes, I don't have to tell you what Mado means, because I know you've seen Reservation Dogs, right? There's some normalization that's happening, but it always feels kind of what Vanessa and Teresa was describing, or Erin, sorry, of like, it's not enough, or sometimes it feels too little too late. But I do hold on to the glimmer of light, the light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that many of us, while we're building from scratch, we're still touching the surface of getting a lot of our communities, how we perceive the fact that we're still here is being understood more and more so than it has in the past, I feel. And with that, I'll get off my boat.
I just actually wanted to touch on something you said. You talked about the land back movement. Would you all be open to sharing a little bit about that, what that means and what that movement is for those in the audience that don't know about it?
Land back is essentially what it is. # land back. I would say my understanding of the movement is rooted in McGirt v. Oklahoma, and where we had the unique situation of the government recognizing what's been understood is never disestablished Indian country. So reservation land, territory, boundaries, those distinct native land has finally been affirmed. And that has a very distinct legal interaction as we've been seeing through headlines, but also across the United States, there's a lot of work around settler colonialism with Indian-led organizations. They would be the best to talk about the roots happening on the national and international level, to be honest. And I will pass it to Vanessa or Teresa for, if y'all have more practical applications of the movement, happy to hear them too. But again, I'm in policy, so that might have been a little bit more removed.
No, Vivian, I think Aaron touched on it with even putting the flags in place, because that's another, we have to look at the fact that that's another establishment of, this is the land that you're occupying now. These are the people who were on this land. That's relevant to show that representation. And it is about the reclamation of not only identity of the land, but then the story, oops, sorry about that, the story of the land that the people hold. That's also part of that land back, understanding what that is. And I didn't realize how much of a land-based person I was until I was traveling back and forth to New York. And every time I would land at LaGuardia and go into the city, I just would have a kind of a visceral experience of sickness, because I wasn't seeing any land. I was only seeing concrete. You land, the plane is concrete, and you go into the city, it's concrete. And I wasn't understanding what was happening, and I was getting depressed. And when I was flying back, on one of the flights, I was flying back home, and the minute we touched down in Oklahoma and I began to see the landscape, I realized that not only was I a land-based person, but I had to really claim that, because I grew up in the country, in a little community outside of Okmulgee, in Okmulgee County called Beggs, and we were on our land. And so land has always been a big part of my life, and I realized why. And making that very defining identity to it, I think, is part of understanding why it's important for people to go back. And I always caution people today here in Oklahoma that, we're still here, and we are coming back to reclaim that. And every time there's politically, there's land available, normally the nations are at the table negotiating as well.
I've had people ask me, because they're scared that we're literally going to just come into their home and make it ours again. And it's more of, for me, it's that recognizing who's here, who was here, the ones, because I know when I talk about, we're on Muskogee Creek land and Cherokee and Osage here at TPS, but also, those weren't the original people that were here. They got brought here. And so it's knowing that as well. And for me, it's like helping children to understand the accurate history. And I know that might get people in trouble. And I know that's an issue in education right now, but I don't see how truth is wrong or bad or scary. And so we have not had issues. We have not been challenged, because I feel like the way our Indian Education Department brings knowledge, it's like, how can you argue with the truth of what we're showing these children? I was actually helping to rewrite our history curriculum, and the person that was helping me, because it takes non-natives to get things like that done, moved to another school. So it's like turnover. And then you're like, we got to figure out, who do I go to now, and how, because here at TPS, I love that they created the Tulsa Race Massacre curriculum. And I was so excited to see that. And we had to take professional development over it. But I stayed after that training, and I said, this is awesome. This is amazing. But why aren't there any lessons about Native history. Like, I appreciate that that's happening, but where are we? And so that's how that conversation happened. And then it was going on, and they were creating 3 new units, 2 of them got done, and then the person left. So it's like, I hope that gets picked up again. But knowing the land, knowing the history of where we're at, how we got here, because I grew up here in Tulsa. We actually have one of our schools renamed Council Oak after the Council Oak tree. So if you don't know about that, go look up that history of why Tulsa is called Tulsa, why the Council Oak tree is important. I'm not Muskogee Creek, but growing up in Tulsa, everybody thinks I am because I grew up in a Muskogee Creek church. I can sing hymns. I can speak the language. I teach my kids the language because we go to Muskogee Creek Challenge Bowl. But I'm not Muskogee. It's just because I grew up here. You have to know the people that you're with. And a lot of my students are that way too. So yeah, land is important, and it's more than just physical land. There's so many things that go with that: language and your surroundings and the people and everything.
Well, thank you all so much for leaning into this conversation that we've been having. Right now, we're going to transition into a Q&A period. Just a reminder to folks that have logged on, this is your opportunity to participate in the conversation, ask our panelists questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom raise your hand function, and I'll be sure to call on you. And with that, I'll kick it off. Before I kick it off with our first question from the crowd, I am dropping in a survey link into the chat. Please feel free when you have a chance to go through that as we're asking our panelists questions. This is a way to keep us talking about a lot more relevant topics and just, engaging with you all and what you all want to hear and talk about as well. And with that, I'll be going into our first question from the audience. And the first one is, how can we be more inclusive of Indigenous women in the workplace?
Can you reread that?
Yes, sorry. How can we be more inclusive of Indigenous women in the workplace?
For mine is, first of all, just identifying who those people are, knowing who they are, and it's hard for education. I feel like you'll figure out who is Indigenous pretty quickly. Especially, it doesn't matter what subject they teach, they're gonna include their perspective somehow, some way. But I don't know, I feel like we need to start telling children that they can do anything and show them examples of what they can be. I never had a Native teacher. I remember I had my first African-American teacher in 5th grade, and I just loved her and I wanted to be like her. Like, it's just having examples and seeing people. So it's like getting them in these positions. So that's the first step. I don't know how.
From my perspective, I think asking that question of people in powerful positions in educational institutions, asking that very question. I don't see anything wrong with, because I ask it all the time. Where are they? I mean, if I go into a community, wherever the community is, in the United States of America or outside of America, because Indigenes is the people of the land, I ask that question: where are the women and where are those Native or those African American communities? Where are they? And if they're not in the place where I am, then I want to know why. And I start asking some more questions, and then I try to find the community and ask the community questions too, to see how can I possibly in that moment be a bridge to let people know, because I can have the conversation to let people know that this might be what's missing and this is why, and this is how you can do outreach into the community and bring people in.
Can you repeat the question one more time, Victoria?
Yes, of course. And if I'm being too soft, please let me know, because it could just be my audio here. But the question was, how can we be more inclusive of Indigenous women in the workplace?
More inclusive. Okay. I would, step one, add Indigenous representation to the workplace. But beyond step one, speaking from my own lived experience, I would have to say, don't take all your bias to be confirmed by the most accessible Indian. Like, if you do learn that you have a Native on staff, they are not your, they're not your person to take all your biases to. Like, I've heard questions, or not even questions, just remarks about, like, oh, you're an alcoholic because you're from the reservation, or oh, you're assimilate, or like I remember very distinctly, like a year ago, someone just, no relationship, walked up to me and they were like, all tribes in Oklahoma are assimilated. And that these are not remarks, that they're not respectful. They're not, you really, I think if you genuinely want to learn and connect, there are some manners to be still had. I think people often approach us still as foreign, even as the original inhabitants of these lands. Like, please don't do that, or please stop. Tell your friends, colleagues, churches, whoever you need to, that who's wanting to do more work with Indian country, there is a tactful way to engage with us, respectfully. And the second half of that, I would say, don't professionally tokenize. Again, don't take all your inquiries to us, but also, like I said earlier, we don't speak for every Indian all the time, right? We're very distinct, diverse in ourselves too, as you heard from Erin and Vanessa and myself today. Like, we all speak from our own specific lived experiences and perspectives. And so I would have to say that do your homework, do your homework to understand and relate. But being a better human doesn't take much effort, I feel. But oftentimes, whether it be rooted in fear or uncertainty, or just there's a level of white fragility affiliated with doing the work and connecting better with Indian country. And so I'm going to be bold here and say, get uncomfortable, get uncomfortable and engage with us. I'm a human too. Like, I always say, I'm a human first, regardless of your political stance and things of that nature, because oftentimes I work with people I don't always agree with. But if we can remember to meet everyone as human first, I think a lot can happen. A lot of positivity can come out of that.
Well, thank you for reminding us all about that important points, y'all. And then we have a question here for Erin, in education. The question is, what are a few things you would include in a description of culturally responsive practices to help teachers understand what it means?
At one point at TPS, we had kind of like a checklist like that. Is first of all, things like, is it culturally accurate? Have you researched from that actual tribe of what you're trying to present? And then also, have you reached out to the Indian Ed department within your school district? Because all school districts have an Indian Ed, whether it's, big like us at TPS. I mean, we have like a staff of 10 to 12 people, but there's at least one person at every school district that's their job, is to help navigate and help with all those cultural things. We get calls every day, and that's what we're here for. And I mean, yeah, they seem like ridiculous questions sometimes, but I know to the person that's calling, that's why they're asking, because they just don't know. And so I would rather them ask and feel a little uncomfortable, and then us just kind of show them the better way to do things. Because I mean, it's been simple things like, I'm going to show Pocahontas to my class. Can you give me a lesson on it? And I'm like, let me give you the real history of Pocahontas. I don't think you're going to want to teach that. And then here's another alternative, something you can do. So it's just starting that conversation, starting that relationship. So yes, there is an Indian Ed department at every district, even if it's just one person, but they're there to help you.
Thank you for sharing that resource. And then I think the last question we're taking for all our panelists are, what support systems exist within tribal nations and communities for Native women in navigating the workplace and seeking to grow in their careers? Do you all want me to repeat that again? I know I paused there awkwardly. Do y'all want me to repeat that? Okay. What support systems exist within tribal nations and communities are there for Native women in navigating the workplace and seeking to grow in their careers?
Mine are short and simple. So there's JOM, there's Title VI. Those are usually the funding that we get. So those departments are within tribes. And then I'm on the board for the Oklahoma Council for Indian Ed. So we're just a group of Native educators getting together and helping the different areas all over Oklahoma. You can reach out to them and us. I'm trying to think of all the matriarch, something that there's an Oklahoma City chapter and a Tulsa chapter. It's just Native women, all different professionals coming together, and we have our own community, but we help and reach out. And that, I think that's really helped me to get to know people I probably would have never met. Speaking of like reservation dogs, like one of the actresses from that is in our matriarch group. And yeah, so just finding there's a group for everything. When you start to look for it, they're out there.
Okay, and then my last question for the panelists from the OCCJ side is, what would you like the audience to take away from today's discussion?
I would say, I would like for the audience to take away a sense of gratitude that these women on this panel were willing to share from a cultural perspective, and that there are people that are in your midst, possibly, that have an Indigenous identity that you might be missing. And we need to actually, as Vivian so eloquently said, we need to respond to the human being, and not what we perceive is, or have been taught that this is what this is, but actually respond to the person in front of us, especially as it pertains to children. Because we missed a lot of children who are Native. We missed them, who they are.
I would say really take into consideration some of what we shared, and piggybacking off Vanessa this time, seriously evaluating your interactions with Indian country, or even yourself, and how you're showing up as a relative, as a community member. Oftentimes social constructs are very fresh on my mind, because when I meet people, it feels like my identity is what people meet first, but more before they meet Vivian. And so maybe asking you all to consider how much of your identity is at the center of how you interact with your community. When you go to the grocery store, do people ask you who you are, or do people immediately tell you how their grandpa or their grandma was a Indian princess, or they lost their enrollment? And if you are doing that, please stop. But like, consider the interacting that you do in the sense of navigating those waters with your identity and other people's identity. And again, meeting people where they are is human first. I will always push that narrative first. So please consider those respectfully. And I just appreciate you all, for whatever reason you joined us today. So I appreciate you for taking the time to and taking interest in this important discussion.
I'll just add that for education, public education especially, there is an Indian Ed department out there. And even if you can't find one, you can email us and we'll get you to the right place. So we're here to help. And also don't feel like you have to be scared to teach Native history, culture, anything, because I don't know everything, but I'm going to help you get to where you need to be for whatever you're trying to teach. And so I can learn with you too. And it's okay. We're all still learning. And there's just all different ways and resources, and we'll figure it out together. So there's hope.
Well, heartfelt thanks to all of y'all for leaning in, engaging, opening up, and sharing your stories and your lives with us. I know it's a vulnerable place to be in, and thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your stories. And thank you all to all our participants for joining. This is a very important conversation, and I'm happy to see how many people value this conversation. And I think from our side, what we would like from OCCJ is for this to continue having these conversations in the different spaces that we engage in our different workspaces, in our different community spaces. The more awareness, the more people talk about it, the more community outside just the homogenous communities we've created, the more global community that we can create. So thank you all for being here. And in the chat, I'm right now dropping the link to our Inclusive Leadership Institute, which I know some of y'all are from. The ILI application for the spring is open. Please feel free to share the link with anyone that you think would be great for the program. This is one of many different conversations that we try to have in workshops that we try to have in ILI. You can also sign up for our newsletter, for the OCCJ newsletter, to keep up to date with what we're doing, the different panels we're hosting in the different months, the different programs we're hosting, and our different community partners. And once again, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for everyone for joining. And I hope you all have a happy holiday season. Bye.